Hey, curious minds. Quick question. Why do some old doors look like they were built for someone smaller, and others look like they were built for someone bigger? And what if the normal human body you were taught to imagine is not a timeless truth, but a choice, made at a specific moment by specific institutions for specific reasons? Because the deeper I went, the less this looked like quirky architecture. It looked like a world that once ran on more than one scale. And before you roll your eyes and file this under internet folklore, hold on. You don't have to believe a single legend to follow the trail. You only have to do one thing most people never do. Measure what's right in front of you. I wasn't hunting for little people when this started. I was doing something painfully unbearable. Measuring. Ratios. Old floor plans. Pre-industrial European buildings. Public halls with doorways too low. Staircases with risers so shallow you almost trip because your foot can't find a natural step. Narrow corridors in administrative complexes, places where, on paper, adult officials, soldiers, merchants, grown men should have moved through easily. For years, the safe explanation was always the same. Regional variation, local style, later restoration mistakes, comfortable, approved. Until the measurements began to repeat. Not once, not twice. And here's the part that kept catching me. The mistakes weren't random. They had proportions, a repeated ratio, like a second set of human assumptions hidden inside the same walls. Across Central and Eastern Europe, between roughly 1720 and 1860, different cities show the same strange feature. Two internal scales inside the same structures. Not renovations, not add-ons. The walls share the same foundations. The stonework matches. Ventilation is integrated into both sets of spaces, meaning both were planned from day one. One scale fits the average adult body we know. The other does not. At first, the cautious hypothesis was obvious. Children, apprentices, servants. Then the details ruined that theory. Workbenches set about 45 centimeters off the floor, covered in long-term wear, not occasional use. Heavy metal tools shaped for smaller hands, but with the kind of erosion you only get from adult force and repetition. Forge ovens with metallurgical residue dated back to the 15th and 16th centuries. These weren't toys. They weren't decorative. They were productive workshops. A child doesn't operate a forge for decades. An apprentice doesn't leave that kind of uniform, repeated wear, on heavy tools unless the work is continuous, normal, expected. And if those benches were only for temporary trainees, why do they appear again and again, built into the same complexes, not tucked away like afterthoughts? So who worked there? And then came the real turn. Photographs, not staged circus shots, not fairs, not oddities being displayed. Administrative photographs, visual censuses, public works documentation, colonial records, group portraits taken with the stiff seriousness of the 19th century. And in image after image, if you actually look, you can see them. Adults between about 1.10 and 1 meter tall, proportioned normally. No obvious achondroplasia, no classic skeletal disproportions. Harmonious bodies, firm posture, eyes straight into the camera. And the context is what matters most. They aren't being presented as curiosities. They're dressed formally, standing beside engineers, surveyors, bureaucrats. In some images, they hold blueprints, measuring instruments, registry books. In several, they're placed centrally in the composition, exactly where 19th century photography signals social relevance. And notice what the photographs don't show. No banners, no spectacle, no "look at this strange person" framing. Just people doing what the state wanted documented. Building measuring, recording. That's why the disappearance matters. It's not a myth fading out. It's a category dropping out of official attention. French archives, Russian archives, British archives. The pattern repeats from about 1840 to 1890. Then it stops. Not gradually, not slowly thinning out. It's a hard cut. They simply vanish, as if an entire human category was removed from the visual record. That kind of cut makes you ask a question you don't want to ask. What can erase a group without leaving a massacre? When a population disappears from documents, historians usually look for the usual culprits: epidemics, wars, migrations, collapse. But here's the problem. There are no clear records of mass mortality tied specifically to proportionate low-stature adults. No mentions of an exodus. No chronicles of conflicts aimed at those communities as such. So what changed? If not biology, what does appear right at the end of the 19th century is something else. Anthropometry. Governments become obsessed with measuring bodies, average height, normal proportions, cranial measurements, ranges that supposedly define what a healthy citizen looks like. And once numbers become policy, policy becomes reality. Once height becomes a line on a form, it becomes a gate, a minimum for service, a requirement for work, a filter for fitness. And filters don't just sort people. Over time, they reshape who is seen, who is recorded, who is allowed to appear in the public picture. These measurements weren't idle curiosity. They were absorbed into legal systems, medical systems, administrative systems. They shaped who was fit for service, who counted as healthy, who counted as deviation. And in a bureaucracy, deviation must be classified. Around the same time, specialized institutions expand: sanatoriums, asylums, long-stay hospitals, officially humanitarian progress. But when you read admission criteria, a disturbing detail shows up. Many people admitted weren't clearly mentally ill and weren't suffering a severe infection. What they shared was physical variation outside the new standard: extreme height, unusual proportions, growth labeled anomalous. From that moment on, bodily difference stops being diversity and becomes pathology. Now look at the built world, because buildings don't remember stories. They remember dimensions. Older buildings with mixed scale are remodeled. Small passages are filled with rubble. Lower levels are sealed. Reduced rooms become ducts, voids, storage. The most chilling part is how normal the language sounds. Up to standard. Modernized. Corrected. No villain speech, no confession. Just paperwork that treats a whole set of spaces as a problem to be fixed. And once a space is sealed, the people it served stop having a place to stand. Renovation records rarely describe what was found inside. They repeat a phrase across countries, across decades. Adaptation to contemporary standards. Sometimes the same wording, sometimes the same idea. Again and again, as if the official goal was not only repair, but alignment, adaptation to standards, which implies that at some point another standard existed. And if that other standard was once normal, what else was normal with it? Here's where the geography gets messy. In cities historically linked, on older maps, to territories labeled Tartary, a wide Eurasian region in early modern European cartography, mixed-scale buildings appear with unusual frequency. Large portals next to tiny doors. Monumental halls connected to compact corridors, all finished with the same ornamental quality. Not improvisation, coexistence. Municipal documents in the 19th century sometimes mention, vaguely, people of reduced stature, mountain folk, smaller individuals. No clear ethnicity, No defined culture, no coherent origin story, just scattered acknowledgements that they were there. That kind of vagueness isn't what neglect looks like, it's what reduction looks like. When multiple sources mention something without detailing it, it often means the detail once existed and then stopped being copied. So here's the hypothesis that makes traditional historiography uncomfortable. What if these people weren't isolated cases? What if they were a population integrated into ordinary life? And what if their disappearance wasn't biological, but administrative? Because removing a group doesn't always require visible violence. Sometimes you reclassify it, isolate it, stop recording it as part of common society. Not magic, paperwork. History preserves what it decides to count. Everything else becomes invisible. And this is where the evidence becomes hard to ignore because it doesn't rely on storytelling. The photographs are still there. The buildings are still there. The measurements don't change when opinions change. A door that's 1.30 meters tall is still 1.30 meters tall 2 centuries later. A reduced-scale workbench doesn't shrink by accident. A network of livable corridors with ventilation and fine finishes isn't built on a whim. Taken together, architecture, photography, medical language, urban reforms, a pattern emerges. Not a final proof, but a persistent question. Maybe the human past was more physically diverse than the modern narrative admits. Maybe standardization didn't just organize society. Maybe it also decided who fit inside it. And if certain populations stopped fitting, their absence wouldn't be a natural mystery. It would be the result of human decisions. When history becomes too smooth, too simple, too perfect, what is it sanding down? After I spotted the pattern in photographs, I moved to construction records, urban plans, renovation documents from the 16th through 19th centuries. And that's where it gets more consistent and harder to dismiss as coincidence. In cities like Prague, Vienna, St. Petersburg, and across Baltic regions, administrative complexes built between roughly 1750 and 1850 share a rare feature, a double internal scale integrated into the original design. Not later expansions, not improvised reforms, same foundations, same stone, same mortar composition, uniform wear. Everything points to simultaneous construction. Within one building, you'll find monumental halls with 6-meter ceilings. Then, a few steps away, corridors whose height drops almost by half. Staircases where one run fits standard human stride and another, built with the same care, fits much shorter steps. The usual explanation says service areas, but pre-industrial service areas were austere, functional, plain, cheaper. These spaces aren't. They have moldings, planned ventilation, natural light, finishes comparable to the main rooms. You don't do that for a storage closet. You do that for regular human occupation. Early railway architecture adds another clue. Some original station plans in Eastern Europe show service windows at 2 heights, one standard, one significantly lower. Later renovations seal the lower openings or turn them into niches. Restoration reports label them obsolete elements. Obsolete for whom? The workshops attached to administrative centers reinforce the same pattern. Metallurgical residue analysis in certain sites shows sustained industrial activity at reduced-scale workstations. Not occasional use, not training. Decades of continuous production. And there's a purely functional point here that requires zero fantasy. Precision work benefits from fine control, shorter reach distances, and close visual access to detail. Smaller hands can be advantageous in engraving, watchmaking, mechanical assembly. If a society integrated different body scales, labor could divide by physical aptitude. Large construction favors size and strength. Fine engineering favors precision. Administration depends on literacy, not height. No myth needed, just social organization. Then comes the late 19th century demographic shift. Censuses expand. Standard categories harden. Height becomes a population datum. Armies set minimum height requirements. Medicine defines normal ranges. Language changes. Variation becomes deviation. At the same time, the institutional network grows. Sanatoriums, asylums, long-stay hospitals, officially humanitarian progress. But some admission records use vague diagnoses, irregular development, atypical constitution, without a clear disease, and many of those individuals vanish afterward. No later census entry, no civil record continuation, no family archive trace. Administrative disappearance doesn't leave drama, it leaves blanks. Urban renewal policies of the same era repeatedly target inadequate housing. That phrase appears again and again in municipal archives. Entire neighborhoods containing mixed-scale architecture were demolished even when structures were sound. New construction followed standardized proportions. Standardization simplifies governance. It also eliminates what doesn't fit. And when you line the timeline up, the sequence feels less like random modernization and more like a funnel. Wide diversity at one end, one normal at the other. Historiography often prefers economic and administrative explanations, and much of this aligns with industrial modernization. Uniformity reduces cost. It simplifies planning. But modernization alone rarely erases a visually documented human category in so short a time. That's the anomaly. And Tartary adds another layer. On many 18th century maps, Tartary is a broad geographic label European cartographers used for large parts of Eurasia. Not a single unified empire in the modern sense. Still, in regions associated with that label, mixed-scale buildings appear frequently enough to force a question. Either multiple cultures independently adopted similar solutions, or there was an exchange of knowledge we don't fully map today. By the early 20th century, architecture manuals lock proportions to an average man. Anything outside becomes inefficient. When a norm enters textbooks, difference starts to look like error. Maybe that's the real core of this story. Not a dramatic cover-up, a gradual imposition of one standard. When one model dominates, earlier diversity begins to feel impossible. But stone stays, sealed passages stay, photographs stay, not as proof of a lost people, but as evidence that the human environment once adapted to a wider range of bodies than we assume. And the research doesn't end with a cinematic revelation. It ends with a tension, the line between what evidence supports and what imagination fills. Yet one idea remains firm. History is shaped as much by what gets standardized as by what gets celebrated. And sometimes the most revealing question isn't what vanished. It's when we decided it no longer fit the picture. By the beginning of the 20th century, the visible trail narrows, not because clues disappear completely, but because the evidence changes form. It's no longer crisp photographs and detailed plans. It's absences, voids exactly where continuity should be. Genealogical records are especially revealing. Family lines documented for generations show interruptions between about 1870 and 1910. A child appears in one census and never appears as an adult. A name shows up in parish books with no marriage, no clear death, no recorded migration. The standard explanation is lost archives or clerical error. And often that's true. But again, the pattern is what matters. In several regions, these blanks coincide with institutional expansion. Admission ledgers from long-term care facilities include broad descriptions: constitutional anomaly, irregular development. In 19th century medical language, those terms could cover any trait outside an emerging norm. Once admitted, a person's social category changes. Citizen becomes patient. If the stay is long, their presence in civil records fades, not necessarily through malice, through bureaucracy. That doesn't prove deliberate elimination. It does show how easy it is for a system to make a group invisible. Another clue surfaces alongside late 19th century education reforms. Schools begin standardizing furniture, desk heights, table heights, row spacing. Regular physical examinations become routine: height, posture, proportions. Children outside expected ranges are referred for evaluation. Education reflects social priorities. An industrializing society prizes uniformity. Factories, armies, dense urban housing work best when measurements are predictable. In that context, variation stops being neutral and becomes a problem. Architecture follows the same logic. By 1900, design manuals promote average measurements and repeatable modules. Custom scale becomes rare. Buildings that don't fit are remodeled or replaced, not to erase history, often simply to increase efficiency. But efficiency alone doesn't explain something else: how quickly cultural memory simplifies. Within a few decades, the idea that proportionate low-stature adults existed outside medical conditions becomes unbelievable. The concept slips into folklore. Children's stories preserve it symbolically. Academia treats it as myth. Collective memory compresses faster than stone decays. That is how differences disappear from history. When something is common, it feels normal. When it declines, it attracts attention. When it vanishes, it becomes legend. Neighbor to rarity to myth. In 2 generations, no grand conspiracy required. Just social inertia. Tartary fits this dynamic neatly. On older maps, Tartary was a broad label for poorly defined Eurasian regions. As geographic knowledge sharpened, the term dissolved into precise national borders. And with it, many associated ideas dissolved too. If physically diverse populations existed in those territories, they were likely absorbed into new national identities. Administrative systems prefer simple categories. Complex diversity is harder to manage. So what remains today? Sealed levels in old buildings. Photos of small adults standing in formal roles. Medical language that converted difference into pathology. Urban policies that favored uniformity. Family records with blanks at the same historical moment. None of this proves a fantasy kingdom, but together it describes a transition from a world that tolerated physical diversity to a world optimized for standards. And maybe the most unsettling interpretation is also the quietest. History didn't need to erase anyone on purpose. It reorganized around medicine, industry, and efficiency, until some variations no longer had a place. When recording priorities change, visibility changes. When visibility changes, memory changes. And when memory changes, the past looks different. Maybe the past wasn't stranger. Maybe it was simply more diverse. And diversity is fragile in systems built on averages. Low doors and high halls don't prove giants or hidden nations. They suggest architecture once responded to a broader range of bodies than we assume. The archives aren't empty. They're selective. Buildings don't lie. They just demand context. Photographs aren't myths. They're frozen moments, and moments don't explain themselves. They wait. So here's the question I'll leave you with. When governments began defining what a normal body is, who benefited from that definition? And who quietly slipped out of frame? When you change the standard, are you organizing the world or deciding who is allowed to belong in it? Because history doesn't only disappear in flames. It disappears in filing cabinets, in categories, in redesigned door frames, in rewritten definitions of healthy. And when that happens, the past doesn't look erased. It looks settled. That's what makes it dangerous. And if the answer makes you uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is usually where the real history starts.